The wind didn't just howl. It screamed with a metallic, rhythmic pulse against the reinforced glass of the Tampa Bay General Trauma Center. It was 11:12 p.m., and according to the latest National Weather Service update, Hurricane Helene had officially pivoted. It wasn't just a coastal brush anymore. It was a direct hit, a Category 4 monster that had just turned the city's bay into a funnel, pushing a 10-foot storm surge directly toward the hospital's foundations. Inside the ER, the fluorescent lights flickered, a stuttering heartbeat that warned of the impending blackout. Dr. Elena Vance stood at the central nursing station, her fingers hovering over a tablet displaying the real-time bed census. She could feel the vibration of the storm in the soles of her orthopedic sneakers, a low-frequency dread that made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. Around her, the ER was a controlled hive of activity. They were already at 120% capacity, with patients lined up in the hallways on gurneys, their vitals monitors chirping a chaotic symphony of triage-level yellow and green. Elena looked up as the ER charge nurse, Marcus, slammed a stack of intake papers onto the desk. Marcus was a man who had survived 3 decades of Florida summers, but the look in his eyes was new. It wasn't fear, but a grim realization of the math they were facing. He wiped sweat from his forehead and pointed toward the sliding glass doors, which were now reinforced with heavy storm shutters that rattled like teeth in a skull. He told her that the EMS frequencies were going haywire, and that the last 3 ambulances barely made it through the rising water on Davis Islands. The bridge was officially closed. They were an island now, cut off from the mainland, and the surge was expected to hit the ground floor in less than an hour. Elena nodded, her mind already shifting into the cold, mechanical logic of the incident command system. She knew that in a crisis, the greatest threat wasn't the event itself, but the paralysis of leadership. She tapped the intercom, her voice steady and resonant, cutting through the din of crying children and the rhythmic thud of the wind. She announced a code black transition. This was no longer just a storm response. They were moving into a total facility isolation protocol. She ordered the immediate initiation of the vertical evacuation plan, moving all non-critical patients to the 3rd floor and above. She saw the younger residents freeze for a split second, the enormity of the task hitting them. Moving 80 patients, many on oxygen or IV drips, through a facility that was about to lose its primary power grid, was a Herculean feat. But Elena didn't give them time to spiral. She began barking orders, assigning specific trauma bays to teams and designating the ICU transition zones. She reminded them that the standard operating procedure was their Bible tonight, but their instincts were their survival. The smell of ozone and wet concrete began to seep through the ventilation system, a pungent reminder that the bay was encroaching. Elena moved toward Trauma Bay 1, where a red-level patient, a victim of a pre-storm car pileup, was crashing. The man was intubated, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. His vitals were bottoming out. She grabbed a pair of nitrile gloves, the snap of the latex loud in the cramped space. She checked the monitor. His map was dropping into the 50s. She called for a rapid response team and a handoff to the surgical suite, but the radio crackled with static. The surgical floor was reporting a leak in the ceiling of the main OR. The obstacles were stacking up, a wall of complications meant to break their resolve. Elena leaned over the patient, her hand steady as she adjusted the flow of pressors. She looked at the young intern across from her, whose hands were shaking as he held the bag valve mask. She told him to breathe, reminding him that the patient didn't need a hero. He needed a technician. She watched the intern's shoulders drop as he regained his focus. This was her element. The pressurized core of a catastrophe where every second was a currency they couldn't afford to waste. Outside, a massive gust hit the building, and the sound was like a freight train jumping the tracks. A distant crash echoed through the halls, the sound of a transformer blowing or perhaps a section of the perimeter fence giving way. She checked her watch. They had 50 minutes before the generators were the only thing keeping the lights on, and 40 minutes before the water reached the ER floor. She looked at Marcus and told him to start the triage for the green patients to the cafeteria, which sat on the highest point of the 2nd floor. She knew the basement was already flooding. The pharmacy and the morgue were lost. They had to prioritize the life-saving equipment. She felt the building shudder again, more violent this time. The hospital was a fortress, but the ocean was a siege engine. As she moved back to the nursing station, a frantic technician ran up to her, gasping for air. The man reported that the backup fuel pumps for the North Wing generators were submerged. They weren't looking at a long night of backup power. They were looking at a countdown. They had perhaps 4 hours of juice if they cut all non-essential loads. Elena didn't blink. She reached for the hospital-wide PA system. She didn't just need the medical staff now. She needed the janitors, the security guards, and the cafeteria workers. She told them that the bridge was down and the water was up, but that they were the only thing standing between their patients and the Gulf of Mexico. The lights flickered one last time and then died, plunging the ER into a terrifying, absolute darkness for 3 long seconds before the emergency red lights kicked in. The red glow cast long, demonic shadows against the walls, turning the hospital into a cavernous, blood-colored maze. The silence that followed the power cut was even louder than the storm. It was the sound of 100 machines switching to battery power, their warning beeps creating a high-pitched, frantic chorus. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that sharpens the vision and slows down time. She knew that the plan she had drafted 6 months ago, the one the board called alarmist, was now the only thing that would keep these people alive. She turned to her team, her face illuminated by the harsh red emergency light, and told them that the ER was now a combat zone. They were going to move every soul in this building to high ground, and they were going to do it before the surge turned the first floor into a tomb. As she spoke, she heard the first splash of water hitting the bottom of the ambulance bay ramp outside. The ocean had arrived. The water began to seep under the heavy storm doors, a thin, dark ribbon that signaled the end of the world they knew and the beginning of the one they had to survive. The water wasn't a wave. It was a cold, black intrusion. It bled through the seals of the ambulance bay doors with a sickening hiss, spreading across the linoleum floor like an ink blot. Dr. Seite. Elena Vance watched it for a microsecond, the red emergency lights reflecting off the surface of the rising tide. The smell of salt, motor oil, and street grime hit her nostrils, a pungent cocktail that confirmed the bay had officially breached the perimeter. She didn't wait for a scream or a panicked shout from the staff. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the nursing station, its beam cutting a sharp white path through the hazy red gloom. She shouted for Marcus, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the trauma bay. She ordered him to initiate Step 2 of the vertical evacuation immediately. The elevators were already being locked out on the ground floor to prevent anyone from being trapped in a flooded shaft. This meant everything. Every patient, every ventilator, every tank of oxygen had to go up the service ramps and stairwells. It was a logistical nightmare unfolding in real time. Elena moved toward the back hallway where the yellow triage patients were being held. The water was already ankle-deep there, swirling around the wheels of the gurneys. She could feel the chill of the Gulf of Mexico soaking into her socks, a numb reminder that the clock was no longer ticking. It was drowning. She found a young nurse struggling to push a heavy bariatric bed against the incline of the ramp. Elena threw her weight into the frame, her muscles straining as they fought the gravity and the slickness of the wet floor. The sound of the storm outside had changed from a scream to a rhythmic thumping, like a giant fist hitting the side of the building. That was the debris, cars, trees, pieces of the pier, being hurled against the hospital's reinforced shell. She told the nurse to keep moving and not to look back at the water. Perception was everything in a crisis. If the staff saw the leader panic, the hospital would fall to chaos before the flood even reached the light switches. In the ICU transition zone on the second floor, the air was thick and humid. The HVAC system had failed when the primary power went down, and the emergency blowers were barely moving the stagnant air. Elena arrived to find a scene of controlled desperation. Families were huddled in the corners of the hallways, their faces pale in the crimson light. She stopped a resident who was carrying a tray of medications and asked for a status report on the ventilators. The news was grim. The batteries on the older transport vents were only rated for 2 hours, and they were already 40 minutes in. They needed to establish a daisy chain of manual resuscitation bags if the power didn't stabilize. Elena's radio chirped. It was the incident command center on the 4th floor. They reported that a section of the roof over the north wing had peeled back like a tin can. Rain was pouring into the electrical conduits. She realized then that they weren't just fighting a flood from below, they were being invaded from above. She felt a momentary flash of exhaustion, a heavy weight behind her eyes, but she pushed it down. She remembered her training at the Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore, the mantra that the captain is the last one to feel the cold. She took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the emergency oxygen being bled into the hallways. She pushed through the double doors into the makeshift red zone on the 2nd floor. Here, the most critical patients were being monitored by the light of headlamps. The sound was a rhythmic whoosh-click of manual bagging. She saw a father holding his daughter's hand, the girl no older than 6, her face obscured by an oxygen mask. The father looked at Elena, his eyes searching for a lie he could believe in. Elena didn't offer a platitude. She squeezed his shoulder and told him they were moving his daughter to the internal pediatrics wing where it was drier. She gave him a job to hold the IV bag steady and watched the fear in his eyes turn into a desperate kind of purpose. Suddenly, a loud boom shook the floor. It wasn't the wind. It was internal. One of the heavy fire doors at the end of the hall had been forced open by a surge of air pressure. and a gust of hurricane-force wind whipped through the corridor, scattering papers and knocking over equipment stands. The temperature in the hall dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Elena fought against the wind to reach the door, her coat billowing. She and Marcus grabbed the handles, their boots sliding on the wet tile as they fought to pull the heavy steel shut against the vacuum of the storm. They slammed it home, and Marcus shoved a heavy crash cart in front of it to act as a deadbolt. They stood there for a second, panting, their breath visible in the sudden chill. Marcus looked at her, his face slick with sweat and rain. He whispered that the water in the lobby was already 3 feet high and rising. The pharmacy was completely submerged. They were running out of vasopressors and insulin. Elena checked the digital counter on her tablet, which was still miraculously connected to the internal Wi-Fi. The battery was at 14%. The hospital census showed 412 souls currently under their roof, and the surge wasn't expected to peak for another 3 hours. They were effectively a sinking ship that couldn't move. She turned to Marcus and told him they were going to scavenge. She knew there were emergency medical kits in the ambulances parked in the upper decks of the parking garage. It was a suicide mission to go out there in 130-mile-per-hour winds, but without those meds, the red patients wouldn't make it to sunrise. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the rational part of his brain telling him it was impossible. She told him that the SOP said to wait for rescue, but the SOP didn't know the water was at the door. As she turned to head back to the triage center, a low, grinding sound vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of the building's foundation groaning under the weight of the water. A light on her tablet flashed. Communication failure, system offline. The last link to the outside world had just snapped, leaving them alone in the dark, surrounded by a rising ocean and a storm that showed no mercy. She looked at the dark screen, then at the flickering red hallway, and realized the hardest decisions were still ahead of her. The silence of the digital blackout was more deafening than the roar of the wind. Elena stared at the dead tablet screen for a heartbeat, seeing her own tired reflection in the black glass. No GPS, no weather radar, no real-time updates from the City Emergency Operations Center. They were flying blind in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. She shoved the useless device into her lab coat pocket and looked at Marcus. The red emergency lighting made the shadows under his eyes look like deep bruises. She told him that from this moment forward, they were operating on analog rules. No more centralized data. They needed runners, hand-carried vitals charts, and a chain of command that relied on voices, not screens. She led Marcus toward the internal stairwell, their footsteps splashing through the water that was now creeping up the stairs from the ground floor. The air in the stairwell was heavy and smelled of damp concrete and old dust. Elena stopped at the landing of the second floor and checked the pressure on a portable oxygen tank leaning against the wall. The gauge was in the yellow. Everything was depleting: power, medicine, dry space, and time. She felt the building shudder again, a deep structural moan that seemed to come from the very marrow of the hospital. She knew that sound. It was the vibration of the storm surge hammering against the glass-reinforced concrete of the lower pylons. They reached the makeshift command post in the second-floor cafeteria. It was a sea of humanity. Staff members were huddled around flickering lanterns, and the sound of crying babies was a constant, jagged edge against the nerves of the medical team. Elena called for the heads of the departments. When they gathered, a ragtag group of exhausted surgeons, nurses, and technicians, she didn't sugarcoat the situation. She told them the bridge was out, the ground floor was flooded, and the digital network was down. She explained that they were now the island of Tampa General. One of the senior surgeons, a man used to the pristine, controlled environment of a sterile OR, asked about the Code Silver rumors, reports of looters or panicked citizens trying to break in through the upper balconies. Elena addressed it directly. She stated that security was being repositioned to the entry points, but their primary focus remained patient care. She looked at the group and told them that the next 6 hours would define who they were as professionals. She needed a scavenge team for the meds in the parking garage and a bucket brigade to manage the water leaks in the north wing. She saw the fear in their eyes, but she also saw the spark of leadership she was trying to ignite. The temperature in the room continued to rise as the humidity became stifling. Elena felt a bead of sweat roll down her spine. She moved toward the window, pulling back a heavy curtain just enough to peer out. The world outside was a terrifying blur of gray and white. She could see the tops of palm trees being whipped like blades of grass, and the water of the bay was a churning, violent mass where the parking lot used to be. A piece of industrial debris, perhaps a shipping container or a piece of a roof, smashed into a nearby light pole, sending a cascade of blue sparks into the night before the pole snapped like a toothpick. She turned back to the room and noticed a nurse, Sarah, staring at a patient whose portable monitor was flatlining. Elena was there in 3 strides. It wasn't a cardiac arrest. The battery had simply died. She checked the patient's pulse manually, strong and steady. She told Sarah to switch to manual monitoring every 15 minutes and to mark the patient's forehead with a G for green status to save resources. She was triaging not just patients now, but the very energy of her staff. The smell of burnt plastic began to waft through the vents. Elena's heart skipped. That wasn't the storm. That was an electrical fire. She grabbed her radio and called the head of maintenance, but the static was thick. She didn't wait. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and ran toward the ventilation closet at the end of the hall. Marcus was right behind her. They kicked open the door to find a small junction box throwing sparks, the insulation melting into a black, acrid goo. Elena didn't hesitate. She pulled the pin and aimed the nozzle, the white CO2 spray coating the fire in a freezing cloud. The fire was out, but the smoke remained, thick and choking. They coughed, their eyes watering as they backed out of the closet. Elena leaned against the wall, her lungs burning. She looked at her hands. They were covered in a fine layer of white chemical dust. She realized then that the hospital was actively trying to die around them. The infrastructure was failing piece by piece. She looked at Marcus and told him they couldn't stay on the second floor much longer. If the electrical fires started in the walls, the smoke would trap them before the water did. She checked the manual tally of the red patients. There were 12 people currently dependent on mechanical ventilation or high-flow oxygen. If she moved them again, the risk of a code blue during transport was nearly 50%. But if she stayed, they might all die of smoke inhalation. It was the classic, least bad option scenario that they taught in disaster management. But the textbooks never mentioned the smell of the smoke or the way the floor vibrated under your feet. Elena stood up straight, wiping the soot from her forehead with her sleeve. She ordered the immediate relocation of the ICU patients to the fourth-floor endoscopy suite. It was the most protected interior space they had left. She saw the exhaustion in the faces of the orderlies, men and women who had been lifting heavy gurneys for hours. She stepped into the middle of the hallway and began to lead by example, grabbing the end of a bed and starting the push toward the service elevator, the one they were still operating manually with a crank and a prayer. As they pushed the bed, a massive thud shook the building, followed by the sound of glass shattering somewhere downstairs. The surge had finally broken the main lobby's reinforced windows. The ocean was no longer seeping in. It was rushing in. Elena felt the sudden change in air pressure in her ears, a popping sensation that signaled a breach in the building's integrity. She looked toward the stairwell and saw a wall of white foam beginning to churn at the bottom of the flight. She knew they had minutes before the second floor became untenable. She shoved the bed harder, her jaw set, her mind already calculating the next move. She had to find a way to get those meds from the garage, or the move to the fourth floor would just be a slower way to lose her patients. The wind outside roared in a new, higher pitch, a sound like 1,000 flutes played by a madman. She looked at Marcus and told him to get the team to the fourth floor. She was going to the garage herself. She knew the layout better than anyone, and she wasn't going to ask a staff member to risk a 130 metaphor wind if she wasn't willing to face it first. The wind in the enclosed walkway leading to the parking garage sounded like a jet engine at full throttle. Elena fought to keep her balance as the structure swayed, the metal groaning under the lateral force of 130 mph gusts. She was shielded from the rain, but the pressure was immense, a physical weight pushing against her chest. In her hand, she clutched an empty medical supply bag and a heavy-duty crowbar she'd scavenged from the maintenance closet. Her goal was the Stage 3 trauma kits kept in the advanced life support ambulances parked on the third level of the garage, the only level high enough to escape the surge but low enough to be reachable. She pushed through the heavy steel door into the garage, and the sound immediately doubled in volume. The garage was an open-air concrete structure, and the wind was whipping through the levels, creating a terrifying vortex of spray and debris. The red emergency lights from the hospital didn't reach here. She only had her flashlight, its beam dancing over rows of abandoned staff cars. She stayed close to the central concrete pillars, moving in a low crouch. The air was thick with the smell of salt and pulverized vegetation. Every few seconds, a gust would spray her with a mist so fine it felt like needles against her skin. She reached the first ambulance, a heavy-duty Ford Transit. The wind was rocking the 3-ton vehicle on its suspension. Elena smashed the side window with the crowbar, the tempered glass exploding inward in 1,000 tiny diamonds. She climbed inside, the interior of the rig a sanctuary of white light and organized chaos. She moved with surgical precision, ignoring the way the ambulance tilted with every gust. She cleared the cabinets of epinephrine, amiodarone, and every vial of insulin she could find. She stuffed the red bags, the high-priority trauma kits, into her pack. As she reached for a portable suction unit, a massive sound echoed through the concrete deck. A piece of the hospital's decorative cladding, a slab of metal the size of a billboard, had torn loose and slammed into the garage's outer wall just 20 feet from her. The impact sent a vibration through the floor that Elena felt in her teeth. She knew she had to get out. The garage was stable, but the flying debris turned the open space into a kill zone. She zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and prepared to make the dash back to the walkway. Suddenly, she saw a flicker of light from across the deck. A flashlight beam, erratic and weak. She froze. There, huddled behind the concrete base of the elevator housing, were two people, a man and a woman, soaked to the bone and shivering. They must have been locals who sought refuge in the garage when the surge hit their homes. They were trapped, terrified to move across the open expanse of the deck where the wind was strongest. Elena didn't hesitate. She knew every second she spent here was a second she wasn't with her patients. But the ethics of the ER didn't stop at the hospital doors. She maneuvered toward them, using the line of parked cars as a windbreak. When she reached them, she saw the man was holding his arm. A piece of flying glass had sliced deep into his forearm, and he was using a muddy shirt as a makeshift tourniquet. Elena didn't say a word. She knelt in the wind, opened her newly acquired kit, and applied a professional-grade tourniquet, clicking the windlass tight. The man groaned, but the bleeding slowed. She shouted over the roar of the storm, telling them they had to move now. She grabbed the woman's hand, the man grabbed Elena's coat, and together they formed a human chain, fighting the invisible wall of air to get back to the steel door. They burst back into the hospital walkway just as a trash can turned into a projectile, shattered against the door they had just closed. Elena leaned against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the two survivors, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. She told them to follow the red lights to the second-floor transition zone. She had the meds. She had more lives in her bag. She ran back toward the main building, her boots heavy with water. When she reached the fourth-floor endoscopy suite, she found Marcus waiting by the door. His face was ghostly pale. He told her the basement generators hadn't just flooded. They had shorted out so violently they sparked a fire in the main riser. They weren't just low on power. The fourth floor was now the only floor with emergency lighting. Everything else was going dark. Elena handed him the bag of meds. She told him to distribute the insulin and the pressors to the ICU teams immediately. She didn't mention the garage or the wind. She just looked at the hallway, a narrow corridor filled with the most critical patients in the city, all of them relying on a few flickering bulbs and the sheer will of the staff. She checked her watch. 02:14 a.m. The surge was supposed to peak in 40 minutes. She felt a hand on her arm. It was the intern from earlier, the one who had been shaking. He wasn't shaking anymore. He told her that they had successfully moved all 12 red patients, and everyone was currently stable. Elena felt a brief flash of pride, but it was quickly eclipsed by a new sound, a low rhythmic thumping coming from the ceiling. She looked up. The roof wasn't just leaking, it was breathing. The pressure differential between the hurricane-force winds outside and the sealed environment inside was creating a lung effect, threatening to pull the roof tiles straight off the joists. If the roof went, the fourth floor would be open to the sky. Elena realized they were caught in a vice, the ocean rising from the bottom and the sky tearing at the top. She looked at her team, the people who had followed her into the dark, and she knew the hardest part of the night was about to begin. They had reached the limit of their protocols. From here on out, they were writing a new one. The fourth-floor endoscopy suite had been transformed into a desperate triage fortress. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood. Every available square inch of floor space was occupied. Dr. Elena Vance moved through the narrow aisles between gurneys, her flashlight clipped to her shoulder strap. The red emergency lights were dimmer now, a sign that the battery backups were reaching their final stage of depletion. She checked the pulse of an elderly woman in bed 4, noting the faint, thready beat. "Double the manual checks on the yellows," Elena told a passing resident. "We can't rely on the alarms anymore. If the monitors go dark, you are the monitors." The thumping from the roof had intensified. It was a rhythmic, violent percussion that made the ceiling tiles dance in their metal grids. Dust and grit rained down on the sterile fields, forcing the surgical teams to use plastic sheets to protect open wounds. Elena reached the central nursing station, now just a desk with a few battery-operated lanterns, and saw Marcus staring at a manual pressure gauge. The hospital's internal water pressure was dropping. The main line from the city had likely snapped. "We have 30 gallons of sterile water left in the tanks," Marcus reported, his voice raspy. "After that, we're down to the bottled stuff in the cafeteria. We have to ration it for the reds and the surgical scrub-ins." Elena looked around the room. She saw the faces of her staff, nurses who had been on their feet for 18 hours, doctors who had performed procedures by the light of a cell phone, and janitors who were now acting as orderlies. They were all looking at her, waiting for the next move, waiting for a sign that their efforts weren't in vain. She felt the weight of their collective hope, a heavy, suffocating mantle. Quick question: would you follow the SOP or trust your instincts? Comment SOP or instinct. I need to know whose side you're on when the world goes sideways. Elena knew the SOP said to conserve resources and wait for a federal response, but her instincts told her that no one was coming for at least another 12 hours. The storm was too large, the surge too deep. She called for a brief huddle. She didn't stand on a chair or raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity that commanded the room. The surge is peaking, she started, pointing toward the windows where the blackness of the night was absolute. The ground floor is gone. The second floor is taking on water. We are the high ground, but the roof is failing. We're going to move the most critical patients into the internal hallway, away from the exterior walls. We're going to create a life corridor where we can focus every remaining watt of power and every drop of water. A young nurse asked about the families in the cafeteria. Elena's heart ached, but her mind stayed cold. She told the nurse that the families would stay in the cafeteria for now. It was safe enough, and moving 400 people into an already cramped medical zone would create a stampede. She had to prioritize the ones who couldn't breathe on their own. Just as she finished the briefing, a deafening crack echoed through the suite. A section of the ceiling in the far corner gave way, and a torrent of gray, wind-whipped rain surged into the room. A patient screamed as the cold water hit them. Elena was the first to move. She grabbed a heavy equipment table and shoved it under the leak, while Marcus and two others dragged the patient's bed toward the center of the room. The wind roared through the new opening, a predatory sound that filled the suite. The humidity spiked instantly, and the red lights flickered and died. For a long, agonizing moment, they were in total darkness, save for the narrow beams of their flashlights. Elena's light landed on the face of the 6-year-old girl she had seen earlier. The girl was wide-eyed, her small hand clutching her father's thumb. Elena realized that if the girl saw her flinch, the girl would lose the will to fight. "Get the plywood from the maintenance closet," Elena shouted over the wind. "We're sealing this floor. Nobody else gets in and nothing else gets out until the sun comes up." She spent the next hour working alongside the maintenance crew, her hands slick with rain and splinters as they braced the failing ceiling. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but the adrenaline was a relentless fuel. She was no longer just a doctor. She was a structural engineer, a general, and a beacon. As they hammered the last brace into place, the building gave one final, massive lurch. The grinding sound from the foundation stopped. The vibration that had been constant for hours suddenly ceased. Elena looked at Marcus, and then at her watch. 03:00 a.m. The surge had reached its peak. The water was no longer rising. But as the silence settled over the room, she realized that being at the peak meant they were now officially stranded in a lake of debris, miles from any help, with a hospital that was literally falling apart from the top down. She walked to the window and wiped the condensation away. Below them, where the city of Tampa should have been, there was only a churning black sea, with the skeletal remains of buildings poking out like broken teeth. "We held," Marcus whispered, coming up behind her. "We held," Elena agreed, her voice barely a breath. "But now we have to survive the morning." She knew the most dangerous part wasn't the storm's arrival, but the slow, grinding reality of the aftermath. The transition from the peak of the storm to the stagnant aftermath was almost worse than the violence of the wind. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the 4th floor, broken only by the rhythmic hiss-click of manual ventilators and the occasional drip of water into plastic buckets. The air was a thick, humid soup that smelled of salt, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of rot beginning to rise from the flooded lower levels. Elena stood at the incident command desk, her hands resting on the edge of the wood to keep them from shaking. The life corridor was packed. Patients were lined up shoulder to shoulder, their lives held together by the sheer grit of the staff. Marcus approached her, holding a handwritten tally. His gait was heavy, his boots squeaking with every step. He reported that they were down to the last 4 tanks of oxygen for the entire floor. The red patients were consuming it faster than they could ration, and the manual bagging teams were hitting a wall of physical exhaustion. Elena looked at the list. Without more oxygen, the math was simple and cruel. People would start dying within the hour. She knew there was a secondary oxygen manifold in the North Wing's isolation ward, but that wing had been partially compromised when the roof peeled back. "I'm going," Elena said, her voice a low rasp. Marcus started to protest, but she held up a hand. She told him that he was the only one who could maintain the order here. He was the anchor for the nurses. She, on the other hand, knew the bypass codes for the manifold system and the exact layout of the isolation valves. She needed to be the one to risk the North Wing's unstable structure. She grabbed a fresh headlamp and a heavy wrench, her eyes locking onto Marcus's. She told him that if she wasn't back in 20 minutes, he was to start the last resort protocol, manually prioritizing oxygen for the patients with the highest probability of survival. It was a terrifying order to give, but they both knew the SOP for total resource depletion. Elena slipped out of the corridor and into the darkened transition zone. The north wing felt like a different world. The wind still whistled through the gaps in the ceiling, and the floor was a treacherous patchwork of wet ceiling tiles and shattered glass. Her headlamp cut a lonely beam through the gloom, reflecting off the standing water that had collected in the low points of the hallway. She could feel the building sway, not the violent lurches of the peak, but a slow, sickening oscillation that suggested structural fatigue. As she reached the heavy fire doors of the isolation ward, she heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a metallic scraping, followed by a muffled shout. She froze, her heart hammering. She aimed her light toward the end of the hall and saw a figure, one of the hospital's security guards, pinned under a fallen equipment cabinet. The man's leg was caught at an unnatural angle, and he was pale, slipping into shock. Elena didn't hesitate. She ran to him, dropping her wrench. "Dr. Vance," the guard whispered, his teeth chattering. "I was checking the perimeter. The wall gave way." Elena assessed the situation in seconds. The cabinet was heavy, loaded with lead-lined containers for isotopes. She couldn't lift it alone. She looked around the wreckage and found a sturdy metal rod, part of a broken IV stand. She used it as a lever, her muscles burning as she fought to create enough clearance for the guard to slide his leg out. She gritted her teeth, a low growl escaping her throat as she poured every ounce of her remaining strength into the bar. The cabinet shifted an inch, then two. She told the guard to crawl, and with a pained scream, he dragged himself free. She didn't leave him. She applied a quick pressure dressing to his leg and helped him into a nearby alcove, promising to send a team back for him. She had 10 minutes left on her self-imposed clock. She pushed through the isolation doors and found the manifold room. The smell of ozone was overpowering here. The primary pipes were intact, but the digital regulator was dead. She had to bypass it manually, a process that required turning a massive rusted valve that hadn't been moved in years. She threw her weight into the valve. It didn't budge. She tried again, the wrench slipping and barking her knuckles. Blood smeared the metal, but she didn't feel the pain. She thought of the 6-year-old girl in the corridor, of the father holding her hand, and of the hundreds of people relying on her not to fail. She braced her feet against the wall and pulled with a primal scream. The valve gave a sudden, piercing screech and began to turn. The hiss of pressurized oxygen filled the room, a beautiful, life-saving sound. She checked the gauges by the light of her headlamp. Pressure was stabilizing. The life corridor would have air. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of herself in a cracked mirror on the wall. Her face was covered in soot. Her hair was a matted mess, and there was a look in her eyes she didn't recognize. A cold, diamond-hard resolve. She looked like a survivor. She made it back to the corridor with 2 minutes to spare. Marcus looked at her, his relief so palpable it was almost a physical force. The oxygen alarms had stopped their frantic chirping, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of the delivery systems. Elena slumped against the wall for a second, her lungs burning, her hands stained with blood and grease. She took a single deep breath of the newly flowing oxygen, feeling it clear the fog in her brain. The sun would be up soon. The gray light of dawn was already beginning to bleed through the clouds, revealing the true scale of the devastation. They had survived the night, but as Elena looked out at the drowned city, she knew the rescue was only the beginning of a whole new struggle. "We're still here," she whispered to the quiet hallway. "We're still here." The dawn did not bring gold. It brought a bruised, sickly gray light that unmasked the nightmare. As the sun struggled to pierce through the thick tropical overcast, Elena stood by the shattered remains of a 4th-floor window. The surge had receded only slightly, leaving the hospital sitting in a vast, toxic lake. Davis Islands was gone, replaced by a churning graveyard of luxury boats, splintered roofs, and submerged cars. The silence of the morning was more eerie than the storm. There were no sirens, no helicopters, only the sound of water lapping against the 2nd-floor bricks. Elena felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Marcus. He handed her a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, likely the last of the dry rations. She took it, the heat seeping into her cramped fingers. Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. He told her that since the oxygen had stabilized, the red patients were holding, but the yellows were starting to deteriorate from the heat and lack of clean water. Then, he hesitated. He told her that some of the senior staff were talking, wondering how a trauma surgeon who had only been at Tampa General for 2 years knew the manual bypasses for a 30-year-old plumbing system and the exact structural weak points of the North Wing. Elena took a slow sip of the coffee, staring out at the drowned city. She knew this moment was coming. The secret she had kept buried since she arrived in Florida. The reason she had left Baltimore and the prestigious shock trauma circuit for a quieter life in the Sunbelt. She looked at Marcus, the red light of the emergency hall casting deep shadows across her face. "I wasn't just a surgeon in Baltimore, Marcus," she said, her voice low and steady. "Before that, I was a lead field engineer for USAID's disaster response team. I spent 4 years in the Philippines and 2 in the Caribbean. My job wasn't just to fix people. It was to keep hospitals running when the world ended." She told him about the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, the way the concrete had crumbled like dry cake, and how she had learned to read the bones of a building. She explained that she had left that life behind because she couldn't handle the ghosts anymore, the people she couldn't save when the infrastructure failed. She had wanted a job where the building stayed still and the power stayed on. She had wanted to just be a doctor again. Marcus stayed silent for a long moment, processing the revelation. He didn't look at her with suspicion anymore. He looked at her with a new, reinforced kind of trust. He told her that it didn't matter why she was here, only that she was. Because right now, they didn't need a surgeon as much as they needed an engineer who could perform miracles with a wrench and a prayer. The moment was shattered by a frantic shout from the life corridor. Elena dropped her coffee and ran. It was the 6-year-old girl, Maya. Her portable ventilator was emitting a piercing, high-pitched whine. The battery was failing, not from lack of charge, but from the extreme humidity. The internal circuitry was shorting out. The girl's father was hyperventilating, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust the mask. "Step back," Elena commanded, her voice dropping into the authoritative tone of a field commander. She didn't reach for another machine. She knew they were all in the same state of decay. She grabbed a manual ambu bag and handed it to the intern. She told him to bag the girl, 1 breath every 3 seconds, and not to stop until his hands went numb. Then, she turned to the father. She told him that she was going to perform a bedside procedure to bypass the need for the heavy mechanical ventilation, a temporary tracheostomy to ensure a more direct, less energy-dependent airway. It was a high-risk move in a non-sterile environment, but the alternative was a slow, mechanical death. As she prepped the tray, her hands were as steady as stone. The engineer in her was calculating the airflow, while the surgeon was mapping the anatomy. She felt the eyes of the other staff on her. They knew now that she was more than she seemed. She performed the procedure by the light of 3 flashlights, the silver scalpel gleaming in the dim light. When the tube was placed and the first manual breath caused the girl's chest to rise perfectly, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the hall. But the victory was short-lived. A low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floor, different from the wind, different from the debris. It was the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter. Elena's heart leaped. She looked out the window and saw a Coast Guard Jayhawk hovering a few hundred yards away, battling the residual gusts. But her relief turned to dread as she saw the helicopter's winch lower a basket toward a nearby apartment rooftop, not the hospital. They were being bypassed. The hospital, as a large-scale facility, was likely being reserved for a secondary phase of the mass casualty SOP. The rescuers were picking off the easy targets first, the individuals on rooftops, while the 400 people in Tampa General remained trapped in a failing hull. Elena looked at the life corridor. She saw the flickering lights, the damp walls, and the exhausted faces of her team. She realized that the SOP wasn't coming to save them. If they wanted out, they had to make themselves impossible to ignore. She turned to Marcus and told him they needed to get to the roof, not to wait, but to signal. They were going to use the hospital's own emergency signaling mirrors, the ones used for maritime distress, to flash the helicopter. "We have to be the loudest thing in the bay," she said, her eyes flashing with a renewed fire. "Get the mirrors, get the flares from the lifeboats in the flooded ER, and get me a radio that works. We aren't waiting for the second phase. We're moving to the front of the line." As she headed for the stairwell, she felt the ghosts of Port-au-Prince fading, replaced by the fierce, protective instinct of a woman who had finally accepted who she was. She was the lead engineer of her own survival. The climb to the roof was a journey through a vertical graveyard of the night's battle, but Elena didn't look down. She only looked up, toward the gray sky where the rotors were beating a path toward their salvation. The roof of Tampa General was a landscape of industrial wreckage. The wind, though no longer at hurricane force, still gusted at 60 miles per hour, tugging at Elena's lab coat as she stepped onto the helipad. The air was thick with the smell of salt and aviation fuel. High above, the Coast Guard Jayhawk was pulling a survivor from a nearby office building, its rotors carving through the heavy, humid air. Elena knew they had minutes before the chopper headed back to the mainland to refuel. "Marcus!" The mirrors! Now! Elena shouted over the gale. They had brought 3 large, polished stainless steel panels, covers from the surgical sterilization units. Elena positioned the first one, catching the weak, filtered sunlight. She began to pulse the reflection toward the helicopter's cockpit. Flash, flash, flash. Pause. Flash, flash, flash. The international signal for distress. She wasn't just signaling for help. She was signaling a priority 1 emergency. Beside her, Marcus was struggling with a flare gun salvaged from the emergency locker. He fired, and a streak of brilliant crimson arched into the gray sky, leaving a trail of thick smoke. The helicopter continued its hover over the apartment complex, seemingly oblivious. The distance was too great, and the pilots were likely overwhelmed by the thousands of SOS signals blooming across the flooded coastline. "They aren't looking at us," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. "They think the hospital is a shelter-in-place zone. They don't know the generators are gone." Elena looked at the massive hospital structure beneath her feet. She realized the pilots were seeing a fortress, but she knew they were standing on a hollow shell. She needed to change the narrative. She remembered her USAID training. In a blackout, use what's left of the energy to create a visual anomaly. She looked at the massive H painted on the helipad. It was white, but the storm had coated it in gray silt. "We need contrast," Elena said, her mind racing. "Marcus, get the maintenance team. I need all the industrial-grade orange biohazard bags from the 4th floor. Every single one." While Marcus ran back inside, Elena grabbed a handheld marine radio she'd scavenged from the garage. She began to cycle through the emergency frequencies, her voice calm but insistent. She used her old USAID call sign, Vance Alpha 7, hoping a veteran dispatcher might recognize the professional cadence. She reported a code Silver Alpha, indicating a total facility collapse with high-risk patient status. The radio hissed with nothing but static. She felt the first drop of a new rain squall hit her face. Time was running out. Marcus returned with a dozen staff members, each clutching rolls of bright fluorescent orange bags. "Spread them out," Elena commanded. "Cover the white H. Tape them down. If the wind takes them, we lose our window." The team scrambled across the wet concrete, their bodies low to avoid the gusts. They began to duct tape the orange bags over the helipad marking, creating a massive, vibrating neon orange X that screamed for attention against the gray backdrop of the building. It was a crude, low-tech solution, but it was a visual disruptor that no pilot could ignore. Elena stood in the center of the orange X, holding the surgical mirror. She waited until the Jayhawk began its turn away from the apartment building. She caught a stray beam of sun and aimed it directly at the pilot's canopy, holding the reflection steady. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the helicopter tilted. It dipped its nose, the rotors creating a massive spray of mist as it changed heading. It was coming toward them. "Get back," Elena ordered her team. "Clear the pad. Marcus, get the triage bags ready. We're starting the airlift with the Reds." As the helicopter grew larger, the downwash became a physical assault, pushing Elena back toward the roof's edge. The pilot hovered just 20 feet above the orange X, the side door sliding open to reveal a rescue swimmer in a black wetsuit. The swimmer signaled with a thumbs up, then pointed toward the mainland. Elena didn't celebrate. She knew this was only one bird, and they had 12 critical patients. This was the beginning of a grueling, high-stakes game of musical chairs where the stakes were lives. She gestured for the first team to bring out Maya, the 6-year-old girl. As the girl's father helped the medics carry the gurney onto the roof, the helicopter's radio frequency finally crackled through Elena's handheld. "Tampa General, this is Rescue 602. We see your signal. We were told this facility was stable. What's your status?" Elena keyed the mic, her eyes locked on the rescue swimmer. "This is Dr. Vance. We have total power failure, basement flooding, and a compromised roof. We have 12 Reds and 400 souls on site. We are not stable. We are evacuating. Send everything you have." There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that, Vance. We're diverting the fleet. You've got 5 more birds inbound. Hold your position." Elena watched as Maya was winched into the belly of the Jayhawk. The girl's father looked back at Elena one last time, a look of profound, silent gratitude. Elena just nodded, her jaw set. But as the first helicopter pulled away, Elena saw something on the horizon that made her heart stop. A second, much larger surge of water was pushing through the bay, the tail of the hurricane, a secondary surge caused by the wind shift. It was a wall of debris and dark water, and it was headed straight for the already weakened foundations of the hospital's north wing. The battle wasn't over. The building was about to take one last hit, and Elena was the only one who knew that the north wing's bones wouldn't survive a second impact. The roar of the departing Jayhawk was replaced by a far more terrifying sound, a deep, visceral rumble that vibrated through the very soles of Elena's boots. She sprinted to the northern edge of the roof, her eyes widening. The wind had shifted 180 degrees as the eye of the hurricane passed, and now the backside of the storm was pushing a massive reverse surge of water back into the bay. It was a wall of black water clogged with the pulverized remains of the city. Docks, trees, and heavy shipping containers, acting like a battering ram aimed directly at the North Wing's vulnerable, flood-weakened supports. "Marcus, get everyone out of the North Wing, now!" Elena screamed into her radio. "The structural pylons won't take a second hit. Move the remaining yellows into the central core stairwell." She didn't wait for a response. She knew the bones of this building better than anyone. The North Wing was an older addition, tied into the main structure with expansion joints that were never designed for lateral hydraulic pressure of this magnitude. If those joints failed, the wing wouldn't just flood, it would pancake. Elena dove back into the stairwell, her heart hammering. She reached the 4th floor and found a scene of renewed chaos. The staff, thinking the helicopters meant the danger was over, were slow to move. Elena grabbed the ER charge nurse by the shoulders. She didn't use a doctor's voice. She used the voice of a field engineer seeing a bridge collapse. She told her that the North Wing was a dead zone in 5 minutes. She began physically pushing gurneys toward the central elevator lobby, the only part of the hospital anchored to the deep soil bedrock. She saw the intern from earlier, his face masked with exhaustion. She told him to abandon the heavy equipment and just move the bodies. "Leave the vents if you have to, just bag them and move," she barked. The smell of the building changed. It was the smell of overstressed concrete, a sharp calcium dust scent that signaled microfractures. Then came the sound, a series of pops like heavy gunfire. Those were the rebar tensions snapping. Elena was at the rear of the evacuation line, ushering the last of the kitchen staff out of the wing. "Go, go, go," she urged, her hands flat against the vibrating wall. She turned back to do one final sweep of the isolation rooms when the floor suddenly tilted. It was a slow, sickening lurch of about 5 degrees. A heavy equipment cabinet tore loose from the wall and slid across the hallway, crashing into a door. The second surge had hit. The impact was a dull thud that shook the entire hospital, followed by the sound of 1,000 panes of glass shattering simultaneously. The North Wing's first 2 floors had just been hollowed out by the debris-laden wave. Elena felt the floor beneath her shudder and drop another 2 inches. She was trapped on the wrong side of the expansion joint. Between her and the safety of the central core, a 3-foot gap had opened in the floor, revealing the churning, dark water 3 stories below. The emergency lights in the wing flickered and died, leaving her in the gray, dusty haze of the collapsing structure. "Elena!" Marcus's voice echoed from across the gap. He was standing in the stable central core, his hands outstretched. "Jump! Now, Elena!" She looked at the gap. The building groaned again, a sound of dying metal. She took a 3-step lead and leaped. Her fingers caught the edge of the stable concrete, her legs dangling over the abyss. Marcus and the intern grabbed her lab coat and arms, hauling her upward just as the section of the floor she had been standing on sheared away with a deafening roar. They scrambled back into the central lobby as the North Wing settled into its new, broken position. It hadn't completely collapsed, but it was detached, a jagged limb hanging off the main body of the hospital. Elena lay on the floor for a moment, gasping for air, her chest heaving. She looked at her hands. They were raw and bleeding, covered in concrete dust. She looked up at Marcus, who was white as a sheet. "You're insane," he breathed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm an engineer," she corrected him, her voice a ragged whisper. "And the building just told me it's done fighting." The sound of multiple rotors filled the air again. The fleet had arrived. Through the lobby windows, Elena saw 3 more helicopters, Navy and Coast Guard, descending toward the roof. The Orange X was working. The evacuation was becoming a precision military operation. Elena stood up, leaning on Marcus for support. She looked at her staff. They were battered, soaked, and traumatized, but they were standing. They had held the line through the dark, the flood, and the collapse. "Let's get the rest of them home," she said, her voice regaining its steel. She moved toward the roof for the final phase. The vilest part of the night was over, and the villain, the storm and the failing structure, had taken its best shot. Now, it was time for the catharsis. But as she reached the helipad, she saw a familiar face. The 6-year-old girl's father had stayed behind. He had refused to leave until he saw Elena come through the door. He didn't say a word. He just stepped forward and handed her the small, mud-stained teddy bear his daughter had dropped during the first evacuation. Elena took the bear, her eyes finally welling with the tears she had suppressed for 10 hours. She realized then that she hadn't just saved a hospital. She had saved her own soul from the ghosts of her past. The final evacuation was a masterclass in resilient leadership. As the midday sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, the roof of Tampa Bay General looked like a busy carrier deck. One by one, the remaining 400 souls, patients, families, and the skeletal crew of staff, were lifted into the air. Dr. Elena Vance stood by the last Jayhawk, her lab coat gone, her scrub top stained with a map of the night's battles. She refused to board until Marcus and the last of the nursing staff were strapped in. The engineer had ensured the structure held. The doctor had ensured the hearts kept beating. As the helicopter ascended, Elena looked down at the hospital. The north wing sat at a tragic angle, a testament to the surge's power, but the central core stood tall amidst the receding black waters. She saw the orange X she had created, now tattered but still glowing, a neon scar of survival. Below, the first rescue boats were finally cutting through the debris, the city beginning the long, painful process of waking up from the nightmare. In the back of the chopper, the silence was profound. Marcus sat across from her, his head leaning against the vibrating hull, his eyes closed in a sleep that looked like peace. Elena looked at the mud-stained teddy bear in her lap, then out at the horizon. She knew her life had changed. The secret of her past was no longer a burden to hide, but the foundation of her future. She wasn't just a surgeon who survived a storm. She was the woman who turned a sinking ship into a lighthouse. This story of resilience reminds us that when the lights go out, your character is the only thing that stays bright. If Elena's courage inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more high-stakes medical dramas. Comment resilient below if you believe that a leader isn't defined by their title, but by the lives they carry through the storm.